Hello everyone, welcome to another stream. Today I'm going to be responding to a video that was posted quite a few months ago now. I've been meaning to get around to this. This is a response to a video that Nathan and I did responding in turn to the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. So this is a stream by, let me just bring it up here. Where are we? Adherent, Apologetics, and what is it? Apologetics Squared. Yeah, they've both got apologetics in the name, so hard to remember which is which. Anyway, so I haven't watched this video. I've sort of scrolled through it a little bit to get an idea of what's discussed, but I decided that I'll do a live react. Those can be fun once in a while. Also, because I've got other things going on, I'm trying to get some real research done on my book that I'm working on naturalism. So I've been working on that. So I decided to, instead of pre-screening, just go through it and do a live react. So just by way of preamble, before I begin, I want to say that I want to thank Adherent Apologetics and Apologetics Squared for their response. It looks like it's a thoughtful response, and I appreciate any thoughtful response. It's always good to get engagement with ideas. It's important to be open to the possibility that one is wrong or has got some things wrong the way around, or the arguments aren't always good, right? So that's important to acknowledge, and to not always be super defensive when responding to criticisms of your argument. So hopefully I can live up to my ideals there and respond gracefully, but at the same time providing pushback where I disagree with anything that they say. So that being said, let's make a start and go through the video here.
Super pumped to join us today. Type Squared, we're going to be a couple of mediocre apologists responding to James Fedor and Nathan Ortman on fine-tuning.
Speaking a little faster than I'm used to. Maybe we'll turn it down a little bit. See how we go.
What's up, Squared?
Oh, nothing much. How about you?
Oh, just chilling. You know, we're about to just try to summarize a 9-hour response video in about an hour and a half. So it's gonna be a lot of fun. So yeah, you pumped?
Yeah, I'm excited. Oh, and
yeah,
by the way, James and Nathan, if you ever make a response video, I did the math. If we make a 90-minute response video to your roughly 556-minute video, that means your response video ought to be 15 minutes long. Just FYI.
We'll leave it out there. But yeah,
it's not going to be 15 minutes long. Actually, I have to go in a little over an hour, so we're going to have to keep it punchy. We'll see how we go with that.
You don't know what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be responding to a video called Bad Apologetics on the fine-tuning argument by Nathan and James. It's 9 hours long, and Squared and I have both listened to the whole thing, and mostly Squared, but a little bit of me, try to do a lot of work in summarizing this entire argument, everything that they try to lay out and respond to with regards to fine-tuning. And Squared has a nice long presentation that we're going to talk through and play some clips and whatnot. So yeah, Squared, is there anything you want to say before we jump into it?
Just that I really enjoyed their video. I think that they bring some really good objections, and they're pretty thorough, obviously. But yeah, I really appreciate their objections. Are fairly high level stuff. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
I mean, I thought the video was a little short. I was expecting more like 14 hours, but 9.5.
Yeah,
okay.
12 at least to really just get through all the stuff. But yeah.
But honestly, I have so much love for Nathan and James, just because they're really trying to engage with the best of what the other side has to say, and they're really they're just not lowballing. And we're gonna talk about their objections, and hopefully to Nathan, Josh, and anyone listening, it'll be edifying. But Squared, are you ready to get this thing started?
Oh yeah, I'm totally ready. Let's go.
Alrighty, so I have your slides put up here, and just let me know when you're ready to play clips and whatnot. So here we go.
Yeah, so as you can see, I might not have a PhD in physics or anything, but I do have Microsoft Paint, so maybe this beautiful slideshow presentation for y'all. And in case you can't tell, this is Zach destroying naturalism with his laser eyes of logic. Anyways, going on.
So nothing wrong with using Microsoft Paint. I often use that for thumbnails just because it's easy. But you can type in Microsoft Paint, right? the hand drawn. I don't know. I suppose it has something to it. Anyway, let's keep going.
So okay, I'm going to first start by summarizing the basic fine-tuning argument, and I'm going to use that visually with the square. So the square, it's a 1x1 unit square, and the area of the square is going to be used to represent probability. So take a indeterministic event like coin toss. There's a 50-50 chance of it being heads or tails, and we could represent that as the area of the square. So 50% of the area of the square is heads, 50% of the area of the square is tails. So we can also break up the area of the square for more complicated events, like say I have a red coin and a green coin. We could have then 4 events: heads, heads, tails, heads, heads, tails, tails, tails. And all these events are equally likely, so they take up a fourth of the probability space. And also I need to mention what happens when we get new information. Like say one of the coins lands on heads, what do we do? Well, if you notice the bottom of the square here, the pink and the orange parts, they have the red coin landing tails. So we know that the pink and the orange are impossible. So what we do is we just erase them from the square. But now we have this kind of more, we have a rectangle, not a square. We got to stretch the remaining 2 possibilities to fill up the entire square, so we get 50-50. There's now a 50% chance of getting heads heads and tails heads. How'd that sound, Zach? Making sense so far?
I think it's pretty straightforward. We're looking at the argument.
Yeah, ways of like cashing out what probability is, but we're talking about like epistemic probability. That's how probable something is that as far as an agent can tell, basically. So the Google digit of pi, is it even? That's a proposition. We could talk about the probability of it. If it's a 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8, then it's even. If it's 1, 3, 5, or 7, or 9, then it's odd. And as far as I can tell, it's a 50-50 shot. I have no reason.
Yeah, so welcome, Spim. So what you're raising here is actually what they're sort of responding to, whether or not things could have been different. So the type of probability that is usually referred to in the fine-tuning argument is epistemic probability, which is probability sort of as far as we know. And this is certainly relevant here to the Googled digit of pi, which we don't know what it is, right? And I actually believe that the digits of pi are not uniformly distributed, if I recall correctly. There's a law about that, isn't there? That it's more likely to be small digits or something. I'd have to, maybe that doesn't apply to the digits of pi. Maybe that's other like heights or something. Anyway, the point is though that as far as I know, it is true that there are as many even and odd digits of pi as each other. And so the point here is that whatever the value is of the the Googled digit of pi is, it is necessarily that value. It couldn't possibly be any different. But the thing is, we don't know what the value is. So the question is sort of one way to phrase this is, what is your epistemic state with respect to your belief about the value of the 100th digit? Presumably you would say it's just as likely to be even as odd before you sort of find out what it is. So that's a way of thinking about epistemic probability. Another way you could phrase it, if you're a betting person, is what odds would you bet on it being even versus odd? And presumably you would go 50-50. Again, if it's true that there are as many odd and even digits in pi, which I believe is the case. Now, the point here is that this is a good example, I think, because it really illustrates that it's not important, at least so far as the argument goes, that it could actually be different in the sense of there's some possible world, or because metaphysically possible, or something that the constants of physics could be different. Just as there's no possible world in which the digits of pi are different. Pi is pi, right? It's necessarily the value that it is. But as far as we know, the Google's digit could be even or odd because we don't know, right? So the modality here is the sort of form of possibility that we're talking about is a representation of our ignorance. And so the version of the fine-tuning argument that Nathan and I responded to, and that Zach and Squared are responding to in turn here, is that of representing epistemic probabilities. Now, this becomes important later when we start to talk about how different hypotheses would sort of constrain or alter those epistemic probabilities. So anyway, hopefully that's reasonably clear about why it's, I think, meaningful to talk about probabilities irrespective of whether the constants could actually be different, like metaphysically, because we can apply this sort of argument even to cases of numbers that necessarily have the values that they have.
Reason to believe it's odd or even. No human has calculated pi that far, I think. So it's just a 50-50 shot. Even though if the Google digit of pi is even, it's mathematically impossible for it to be odd. And if the Google digit of pi is odd, then it's mathematically impossible. Not act like, is this number here prime? Well, I happen to know the mathematical factoid that the bigger a number is, the less likely it is to be prime. So I think it's really probably not prime. But as you could probably see fairly quickly, epistemic probability is also going to vary a lot depending upon a given agent, what facts they know. Like you might already happen to just know off the top of your head that that number is prime, but I don't. So, and I haven't checked it. So that's kind of an idea of probability here. So now here's what the standard fine-tuning argument is going to look like. We have theism and naturalism. Here I've drawn them as roughly the same prior probability, like the same starting out probability. You might think one has quite a leg up on the other, but pretty soon that's not going to matter because we're going to look at a piece of data. So we're going to first, we're going to look at a piece of data soon, but before that, sorry, don't want to get ahead of myself. We're going to color in theism and naturalism with colors green and red. Green will represent the probability that we'll get a fine-tuned universe, and red is going to represent the probability we're going to get a non-fine-tuned universe. So coloring in theism, we get that most of it's probably going to be green, because if theism is true, you have like a god who's all good and stuff, and wouldn't he create a fine-tuned universe? Like, I mean, obviously there's going to be some, right? Because God could decide to not create a universe, but you get a...
He's all good and stuff. I just find that funny. Yeah, so I'm going to take issue with this, but it does say according to theists, so that's fine. And I think they discuss this later, so we'll just keep going for the moment.
Good chance of God creating the universe. Now, for naturalism, we're going to color in green and red the epistemic probabilities. And smart people with lab coats and PhDs and expensive supercomputers and all that have run all the calculations, and they found that actually
Yeah, so this this issue about whether being smart and having a PhD sort of correlate with each other could be questioned, but perhaps that's for another time.
naturalism is just a sea of red with one green dot. So like that is to say, if you vary the constants, the physical constants that appear in all our fun physics equations, you very quickly get a non-life permitting universe, a universe that can't have life in it. It's only in this very small range, this green dot of values, that you can actually get any life in it. Now, Zach, do we happen to live in a universe that can support life?
We know the universe is 99.99% life prohibiting, so it's obviously a red universe. But it's a green one.
Okay, well, the fact that there are people in it, though, is what the fine-tuning argument cares about.
Exactly,
So,
yeah.
Yeah, so the universe is a fine-tune. That is to say, like we got the coin flip earlier that gave us new information. The fact that we live in a universe with life in it, that is some information that we care about. And so that means we basically gotten a green dot. We know we know that the green is true, basically. So that means we have to get rid of all the red. But now that we've gotten all the red, we need to get a square again. So we're going to stretch all the probability space that's green and in equal proportions until we filled up the whole square. But what happens then is that theism is basically just going to dominate the entire probability space. And here, let me get their colors back to blue and yellow. Whereas naturalism now just occupies this tiny space of the probability space here. Theism dominates. We're virtually certain now that theism is true. So that's the fine-tuning argument in a nutshell, visualized with this square. I like squares. But James is going to come along and say, no, he doesn't like this version of the fine-tuning argument. He doesn't think it works. He's going to blow it up with his laser eyes of logic. There we go. So now I'm going to get into James Fedora's objections. I'm basically attributing this all to Fedora, but like Nathan Ormond, he gives a lot of objections, but they're mostly articulated by Fedora, so that's why I have his name on all this stuff. Anyways,
sorry, Nathan.
So Fedora's actually gonna he's already going to object at this first part. He's going to say that you could have you might be an individual who thinks that theism is super duper unlikely, so like maybe you just get a sliver here. But setting that aside, and for the sake of my drawing as well, we're just going to assume that they start with on a roughly equal playing field. So a theist will not want to say that God is indifferent to creating a fine-tuned universe. That's going to make theists sad because, well, then the probability that God would create a fine-tuned universe is going to be roughly the same probability that we get a fine-tuned universe on naturalism, just from the product of randomness or indifference. So what the theist is going to want to say is that there's God's going to have a higher probability of creating a fine-tuned universe. He's going to be predisposed towards it. But they're not going to want to say that 100% of the theism probability space is green as well. That's also going to make the theist sad, because if 100% of the probability space is green, then that would make the universe necessary. That is, there's no possible way to have the God without the universe, and that violates Christian doctrine. So the theist is going to want to add some super specific theology to their theism, so that we avoid indifference which would make it equally likely as naturalism, which would make a green dot equally likely as naturalism. But we don't want to be 100% green either. We're going to want to add some theology to get like this kind of Goldilocks in the center probability distribution of green and red. But when you add this theology to your theism, that makes it more complex. And if you add complexity to a particular idea or a particular hypothesis, that actually shrinks its probability. So theism now, because we added this theology, occupies less of the probability space. It's just in the corner now. But if you thought that was bad, Fedora's just getting started. There's also the fact that like God can create us as immaterial beings that don't have physical bodies and therefore wouldn't occupy fine-tuned universes. Even though this would be life, this wouldn't be a green dot. It would be some other color. So I'm just going to use orange. There's this good chunk of the probability space where God creates life, but it's not physical life in a fine-tuned universe. So now green is just this tiny little sliver of the theism space, even after we have all this nice theology.
Yeah, so this point is eloquently described in the paper Electrons in Love. I forget who the author of that is, but if you Google Electrons in Love, I'm pretty sure you'll find it. So that's, and I mean, these almost look like electrons in love, right? There's like a combination of like an electron with vampire Casper or something. I don't know. That's a nice little image there. But yeah, I think this is a good presentation so far. Let's see how we go forward.
Theology. But you might be thinking, okay, well, whatever. We're still going to win when we uncover that naturalism is just this one tiny green dot in a sea of red, right? Well, not quite. James is. I keep switching between calling him James and calling him Fedora. I better pick one. James is going to say, hey, we have checked that around this one green dot, which is our fine-tuned universe, to get carbon-based life, mixing up with the constants, like modifying them ever so slightly, that results in a universe that cannot have carbon-based life. However, it's epistemically possible to have universes that are governed by a completely different set of equations, or life that isn't carbon-based even in our own universe. And we just haven't looked into any of this stuff. Most of the probability, the epistemic probability space here is completely unsearched. So like we have this fog covering it of just not being looked at yet. We don't know what's under there because we haven't put the time and effort into looking for anything besides universes that are relatively similar to ours, and whether life relatively similar to ours could survive in that universe. Yeah, sorry, I know that, okay, right, sorry, there is going to be some other epistemically possible kinds of life.
Yeah, well, it's more, maybe he's just going to say this, but it's more than just that we haven't looked into it, although I don't think that there has been a lot of work into that from what I've seen, and even from what like Luke Barnes and others talk about. But I just don't think we have any ability to assess whether vastly different sets of constants would be susceptible to life or not. Again, the question I raise is, would we be able to tell just from the equations of quantum field theory and the values of constants as they actually are, would we be able to tell that life was possible in our universe if we didn't already know, right? Somehow if we were looking from the outside and just had the equations with constants, would we be able to tell? Presumably we'd be able to predict things like the existence of electrons and protons and stable atoms, but would we really get life out of that? I don't know. That's not really something we can determine because we kind of know the answer already, but I'm skeptical that we will be able to know. We wouldn't certainly be able to derive sort of all of chemistry or less of all biology from that, at least with our current computational abilities to like perform simulations and so forth. And so the idea that somehow we are currently able with our current levels of technology and theoretical developments to tell whether or not these vastly different universes would support life, I'm very skeptical of that. I just don't see the argument for why we would expect that we would be able to know. Again, typically what's examined is whether types of structures that we think would be necessary for life, such as carbon atoms or even any type of atom, would be possible to exist in these hypothetical universes, and the answer is generally no for a large proportion of them, and therefore it's inferred that life wouldn't be possible. But I'm fairly skeptical about that approach, about that methodology. Anyway, but I've talked about that in previous videos, so I think I just want to emphasize it's less just of a people haven't looked and more of a I don't think that we have the capabilities to tell about most of parameter space, about whether it's life permitting or not. So I'm skeptical that fine tuning. I mean, this puts me in a minority, right? I don't think it's established that the universe is fine tuned for life. Anyway, let's keep going. By the way, I don't think this is essential to my objection, right? I think that this is something that I probably overemphasize in my book where I talk about this. Although I don't think it's established that the universe is fine tuned for life. I think that even if it was, theism is not a good explanation for it. So there's sort of two separate issues there. But anyway, let's keep going here.
That could exist, like crystal-based life. We haven't had those PhD smart people with supercomputers check what possible universes could have crystal life in it. And here's an episode of Star Trek where there was a crystalline being, a totally different kind of life that they met. And James points out lots of other different epistemically possible forms of life. What he's essentially doing is he's going to this fog and picking out tiny pinpricks of the fog, like removing it and revealing green dots beneath it. Do you want to play a clip where he goes through like different forms of life and all that fun stuff?
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll pull it up. It's take about 15 seconds. So if there's anything else you want to add before I do,
Nope.
I pull it up, just let me know. I love how long this video is because it's so thorough, but then it's so hard to like find specific timestamps because it's so long. So
yeah,
here we go. Here's a clip that we're gonna play. Put it up on the stream here. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, I'm just going
to
skip over this because I don't.
Baryons and stimulus. It's really
Okay, but yeah. Squared, are you there? Can you hear me?
Sorry, I muted for that part and I forgot. Okay,
I want to raise those points again. I'll raise them again. No, that was before I removed that on the bookshelf.
If you look at this, now it's not so clear that there is just a blob of green hiding underneath the fog on the naturalism side. So now you're like thinking, okay, man, there's not really a clear winner here between the theism and naturalism. And it gets even worse because at the end of the day, James always has the ability to add something like some metaphysical thesis on top of his naturalism, like the idea that there's a multiverse or some universe generator or a mysterious disposition. And what that will do is we'll add complexity, like we discussed, to naturalism.
So that disposition is the Malpass's stalking horse hypothesis, right? Which is, well, that's one of the places where we get this idea from, right? That you can just postulate some sort of mysterious disposition that the universe has to have constants that are life permitting, or something along those lines, which is not a very good explanation, right? But the idea is that it parallels what the theist is doing. Anyway, just to clarify what that's about.
Naturalism, excuse me, and therefore shrink it, but it will add a nice blob of green to the naturalism side. So that's always an option available to the naturalist. So it seems like the theist doesn't have much of a good argument here. Now, obviously, because we're making this, I'm going to object to a lot of the points Nathan raised. So let's get into that. So first, I'm okay with like 100% of the theism space being green. The Christian doctrine doesn't actually say that there's a non-zero probability that God would refrain from creating the universe. It just says he could refrain from creating the universe, as far as I know. So that means that all you need is an infinitesimal point, or that a point with an area of 0 that's red, to have a possibility. You don't need any area which is red. You could have 100% of the area of the probability space be green, even if individual points are a different color. So what this basically means is James is presenting like this kind of Goldilocks thing. You don't want to be too hot or too cold. And I'm basically saying, hey, it doesn't matter how hot it is. I'll pretty much always be fine. I just don't want it to be cold. So what I'm going to try and do is introduce some sort of theology which explains why God would want to create physical kinds of entities like you and I. And I'm not going to worry too much about trying to put the brakes on that once the probability gets up to 100%. I'll just let the probability fall wherever it lies.
Well, I think the interesting question there, and maybe he'll clarify this, is whether we think that God had a choice to create the universe, right? So I think what I said in the original video is that typically theists say that God chose to create, that it was his sort of decision, that he could have not created. And so epistemically, we'd want to say that there's some probability that he didn't create, right? We wouldn't want to say there's a 0% probability that he didn't create. At least that's how I typically understand what theists and as well as Christians would say. And I suppose that Squared here, I don't know what his real name is. I'm just going to call him Squared. That's what he calls himself. I don't know what Squared here would say about that. But anyway, let's see where this goes.
So now when I'm introducing my theology, what I'm basically trying to do is say that the green is going to be more likely than, say, orange or even red.
I'm muted. Might want to brush up on his measure theory. So it seems what he said is consistent with measure theory, right? So you can have, from my recollection, you can have a set that has a 0 measure, but still has units in it, right? Like if it's a finite set embedded in an infinite set, then it will have a measure of 0, but still not be the empty set. So I think that that's possible, if I've interpreted what he said correctly. Anyway, that don't worry about that if you have no idea what I was talking about. I barely know what I'm talking about when I talk about measure theory.
I'm going to try and give you an argument for you to see that, like why we wouldn't have just disembodied minds.
So it's why we'd expect like God to create like some sort of like fine-tuned universe that like supports like
rather than just like minds that lack any sort of physical body or any need for fine-tuning.
Mm-hmm.
Now
I feel like we're putting the cart before the horse a little bit here, because I think we need an argument as to why God would create minds at all, let alone embodied ones. That perhaps we're going to get one, but there's a two-stage there. First of all, why God's creating minds at all, and then the second question is to why they have to be embodied. And then there's a third question, really, which is why God, even if God wants to create embodied minds, why does the universe need to be fine-tuned for those embodied minds? This is another issue that I raised, is because, well, to say that God can only have embodied minds if there's a universe with laws fine-tuned for them is to say that God can't do miracles, which is wrong, right? God could just miracle up a universe, the existence of embodied minds within which is physically impossible, but yet they exist anyway because he's God. He can do that sort of thing if he wanted to. So again, there may be arguments against all of those, but there are distinct issues here that need to be dealt with. But again, let's see where they go with.
I'm getting from theism to adding some theology to it, I'm going to try and minimize the shrinkage that happens, the shrinkage of the probability space. But how do I do that? Well, there's more, but there are two of the criteria I'm going to focus on is complexity and expectedness. I don't want to add a super complex theology, and I also want the theology to be rather expected already under theism. So you could think of a bad kind of theology to try and argue for fine-tuning is like a theology where God likes the existence of carbon atoms. that has a lot of complexity, and there's no reason to expect that on theism. So that's not the kind of theology I'm going to be invoking. Instead, I'm going to invoke this theology. God likes relationships, as represented, obviously, by this red heart here. God likes relationships, and that's all I'm going to try. And I'm going to try and use this theology, although God likes relationships, to get to we need something like a physical universe. How am I going to do that? Okay, well, imagine you have two minds, and they're not physical yet. Just God creates these minds, doesn't have a body. They don't have bodies or anything. They're just disembodied. Oh, that's redundant. Anyways, we have these two minds, and I've illustrated mind one on the left and mind two on the right here. But again, they're disembodied, so they have no physical relation to each other. Now, at the very minimum, what is going to be required for them to be able to have a relationship? Well, oh yes, as illustrated by this heart here. Well, what you need to have is if one mind intends for the other to experience something, the other mind will then experience it. But how do you get that? I mean, you could just, well, God has some options because, he's God. But what do you have? You do have some options. One, it could be that God just instantaneously, or God grants mind one the ability to just imbue mind two telepathically with whatever experience mind one wants mind two to experience. So mind one just grants mind two experiences. Now, this will get messy for when you have a lot of minds all in different relationships. Like are they all telepathically communicating back and forth with each other? This creates quite a muddled web of telepathic communications between all these different minds. What would be a lot nicer, a lot easier to keep track of for these poor minds is if there's like one common thing all in between them all that they could all interact with. They could all set the state of it in a specific way, which I represent. They're all like contributing to different colors or whatever. And
So I feel like I'm not on the train already. The train's left the station and I haven't got on board yet because I'm not clear why God likes relationships. Or why relationships require separate minds, although that last bit is a little less clear to me. But with the first point, why does God like relationships? Like, why does he want to create minds to have relationships? Is God not perfectly self-sufficient all by himself? What happens to divine aseity? Aseity? I think it's aseity. God's self-sufficiency and his perfect, fulfillment in the way he is as he is. Why does he need to create extra minds? It's not like God is needy. I mean, it may sound like that if you read the Old Testament in particular, but God is not supposed to be needy and require extra people to like talk to or keep him company or even keep each other company. Things are just fine the way they are with God. God still then chooses to create even despite that fact, which I don't understand. And I think that some explanation is needed as to why God bestirs himself to do anything. But let's just suppose that God has his... I mean, this is the issue, right? That you might say that God doesn't have any reason to create. He just sort of does it on a whim, like for no reason. God's creative acts could be irrational, not irrational. Irrational meaning not done for any reason, right? That would circumvent this objection because you don't have to find a reason why God creates. But it seems to me that theists typically hold that God created for a reason, and which raises the question as to how God can have a reason to do something that doesn't seem to have any benefit to anything, right? According to, again, if you buy divine aseity. Now, maybe there's a way around that I'm not familiar with. I'm not a theologian. I've never claimed to be, right? I'm just raising things that seem to be issues from my point of view. But let's just put that aside for now. But I feel like that wasn't really addressed here, but maybe it's coming up. And come to the issue of, okay, so suppose God does want to create and he really likes relationships for some unspecified reason, or he wants to create a relationships. Why do you need separate minds for that? And the reason I say that might sound odd is that isn't God supposed to be a trinity, at least according to Christians, right? Now, the way that that's typically explained to me is that there's three persons in one being. Now, I don't know if that means three minds. I mean, you'd have to talk to a Christian theologian because I really don't know. The way that I've heard it is not that there are like three minds. But if that's true, then so if there is not three minds in the Trinity, then this model doesn't seem to work because you can have relationships, because there's definitely relations in the Trinity. That is something that Christians talk about a lot. The relational, like internal relational nature of God between the three persons of the Trinity. Not so much that there are three separate minds within the Trinity, but if there are not three separate minds within the Trinity, then you don't need separate minds for a relation. If you do need minds for a relation, then that means there are three minds within a Trinity. Now, does that pose issues? It seems to me that it probably does, and that's not how I've understood the Trinity, but I mean, who understands the Trinity, right? So maybe I got that wrong. So yeah, those 2 points about why God creates anything, particularly like why relations, and then do you need minds to have relationships? I'm not sure that either of those have been established. especially when you consider the Trinity. But okay, let's put those on hold for the moment. Maybe we'll come back to them later. Now let's just assume that God wants to create minds and assume that God wants to create relationships and that you need minds for a relationship to exist, like different minds. The question is, what follows from that? And I think someone like Swinburne has argued something like this, if I recall correctly. I do need to read more of what he said. I think where we're going here is trying to make an argument for some sort of embodied external world in order to serve as a substrate for these minds to interact in. So let's hear the development of that argument, and then I'll respond.
They could all also check the state of it. That way, they could all interact with each other and by interacting with this intermediate medium. And obviously, that if they're going to be interacting with this intermediate thing to be able to interact with each other, they have to be quite familiar with how this intermediate thing works. They have to be able to control it. There has to be like regularities to how it works, so that they could use it consistently. This sounds quite universy, this intermediate thing that they're all going to be interacting with. So for me, at least, the fact that there's a physical universe where I could like use it to say interact with Zach's disembodied mind I intend to cause some sound waves. The sound waves in this intermediate medium, the universe. He has ears that can pick it up, and now his mind has an experience. So I can intend for Zach to experience, say, the sound of my voice, and I can actually actualize that. So something like a physical universe, I would say, is quite expected under theism. And the idea that you have physical bodies, I think that's also quite a good idea, because that allows you, if the medium, its states are too complex for you to grasp entirely in your mind at once, then having a body allows you to like go around and check different parts of the state of this physical medium, and it also interact with localized parts and interact with individuals at any given time. So I think that even if it's not entailed, it's heavily implied by God's love of relationships, that you would have something like a physical universe. And I'm not going to go too much into why God would want relationships, because there's a whole question about moral theories and whatnot, but I think that a plausible moral theory would have relationships between agents, like loving relationships being a good thing. Anyways, is there a clip that we had with that?
Are you talking about the Craig moral argument one, or why would I create fine-tune universes?
No, I think I go over the moral argument stuff later.
Okay.
So I'm just going to move on. No.
Okay. Can I just summarize just to help people that are tracking along? So I think what you're trying to get at is responding to James has this objection that you hear a couple times throughout the video, where it's like, why would God need to create a fine-tuned universe that would allow for like carbon life such as us? Like he could just create like disembodied minds or things like that. Surely God's a disembodied mind, so he could just create other ones. Then you're just kind of counter that objection by showing like there's good reason to think that God would want to create some sort of like physical universe with like embodied minds so they can like interact with each other. Just trying to summarize that section.
Yeah, I'm trying to go from really abstract stuff, like we just want relationships, okay? Like from that really abstract point, what would be useful or good for relationships for that? From that really abstract theoretical area, we work to this kind of if there's going to be some medium that you could have a bunch of agents interacting with that is has regularities built into it, and that is that's really close to a universe. So the fact that we do live in a fine-tuned universe, that's something I would expect a lot on theism.
Okay. So, yeah, I think that's a great summary.
Okay, moving on.
All right, so that's that part. So the next part is about other kinds of life. So let's respond to this part here. And I wanted to show this diagram because I think it's helpful to illustrate one point of it. So I don't think this is a very good argument. And I'm sure that it's been developed more at greater length elsewhere. Again, I think Swinburne makes an argument somewhat like this, so something I want to look into more. But let me just respond to how it was presented here. So again, at this point, we're assuming that God wants relationships, and you need minds for relationships. So let's just grant that for the moment, even though he said that he's not going to say a whole lot about why that's, at least at this point, about why God wants that or why that's good. Now, the argument is that in order for minds to have relationships with each other, there needs to be shared experience or like connections between them. I think broadly that seems reasonable because you need some way of interacting between minds in order to have a relationship. It seems hard to imagine a relationship that doesn't involve any type of interaction between their mental states. So I think I'm all right with that. But he then raised a possibility, which is illustrated here, about, well, why can't they just have some sort of telepathic relationship with each other? direct or relatively direct access to each other's minds. Perhaps you can allow someone to access your thoughts, or you can block them from accessing certain thoughts, or maybe God mediates this as some sort of miracle, right? And the argument against that was just that it would be like complicated and messy because you have all these different connections between people, and then it's sort of better for them to have sort of a single reality that mediates between them. But I don't understand what the argument actually is, because this web of relationships exists anyway. Each of these lines represents a relationship between the persons, and I guess indirectly their minds as well. Now, the fact that that may be mediated through a central reality doesn't change the fact that the same number of relationships exist. Having an external reality that exists between you and the other person actually, to my mind, complicates the situation, because I don't have any direct access to the other person. I only have inferential access to what they're thinking and feeling and how they think about me, and are they telling the truth? I can only guess at those based on their interaction with the same environment that I interact with. So if anything, it seems to make it harder. Wouldn't it be better to have more direct access to someone else's thoughts and emotions? And Star Trek, for example, has lots of examples where species are able to communicate telepathically or mind melts and things like this. And that's presented as a way of having a deeper, more substantive and direct relationship between people. You learn things about someone, are able to connect with them in a deeper way when you mind meld with them, or if you can access them telepathically. And obviously we don't know that because it doesn't exist in the real world, but it seems to make some intuitive sense, right? That there would be a deeper connection possible between people if they had direct mental contact with each other, or more direct than we're able to have in the real world. So I just don't buy this idea that somehow it's better to not have direct mind-to-mind contact, either through telepathy or some sort of divine mediated miracle. And instead, it's better to have this material world that impinges between us and other people. I just don't see how that's better. It's not simpler, because you have to introduce this whole world in for people to move around in, and then they have to make all these inferences about what the other peoples are thinking and feeling instead of having direct contact with them. You still have the same number of relationships, so this web thing is the same, and I still have to store memories and inferences and everything about all the other people's minds. It just seems now more complicated because I don't have any direct access to that. So I don't see what the argument is. If God wanted relationships, then he could make a whole bunch of disembodied minds that can communicate directly with each other, or maybe mediated through divine miracles. Or he could make some sort of law-like but non-physical system. That's also conceivable. Whichever way he did it, then there'd be minds that could communicate and interact and have relationships with each other without any physical world. I don't see what the problem with that is supposed to be. Someone before mentioned, and I'm actually not sure, Christians may differ on this, about whether heaven is a place like this, whether heaven is a physical place or not. Now, Christians typically believe in a resurrection, which is physical, right? So I guess there's some sort of physicality in heaven, but I'm not entirely sure how that works. Or whether that's true in hell as well. Like, can there be any type of interaction that isn't physically mediated? So another issue here for Christian theology, what about angels or demons? Like, are they physically embodied? The typical view that I've heard, at least some Christians express, is that they're not, but they can still interact with people and presumably with each other. Like, Satan can tell his demons to do things and God can talk to his angels, right? None of whom are embodied. So it seems that God sans the incarnation is not embodied. Always have to make that caveat here. And so it seems under Christian theology, or at least a common Christian theology, it's perfectly possible to have relationships between disembodied minds. It seems conceptually coherent, as in terms of what we're thinking about here. And in fact, there seem to be positive arguments in favor of it. As I've just mentioned, it would seem to permit deeper and more direct and more substantive connections than perhaps are possible with a sort of physical world mediating and sort of getting in the way. So I just don't find this very persuasive. It seems pretty ad hoc. A pretty ad hoc argument to make that you need this extra stuff. It's like, we want minds to communicate and interact with each other, but to do that, you need to make some stuff that's not minds, that the minds have to do indirectly. Like, why do it that way? It just seems really weird to me and undermotivated. Now, the idea that we want to have some sort of law-like regularities was also mentioned there was some slide about that, in order for agents to be able to sort of predict their actions. Yeah, familiarity, control, regularity. So again, plausibly, there would need to be at least not total chaos for agents or minds to be able to interact in a meaningful way. At the very least, you would need to have sufficient continuity of thought, right, to be able to communicate a thought or to have an emotion or something like that. I mean, it couldn't just be total chaos. How could you have a mind that was total chaos? I don't know. But the point is that I don't know that you need very much regularity for that, particularly in the external world. So let's think of an example here. What about online worlds, like massively multiplayer online games. These are worlds where there is certainly regularity, but they're not physical. The world doesn't physically exist. I suppose you could say that the substrate that generates the world physically exists, like the servers, right? But the world itself is not physical. It's a digital world. It's I mean, it's not real, right? It's hard to sort of explain. It's not an idea, but it's not physical. It's, I don't know, somewhere in between. It's a digital representation that is sort of instantiated through a combination of stored data plus recreations on many people's screens, and to some sense in people's mind, like they sort of imagine that they're part of a world that's sort of simulated in front of them. Anyway, the point is that it seems you certainly can have real relationships and interactions between minds, between people, between characters in these digital worlds. And so, is it the case that we need a physical world? Like God, presumably, could create a simulation that doesn't have any physical substrate, just like a digital world. I think Inspiring Philosophy has said something like this before: that God is effectively simulating the universe. Other people, I think some Hindu traditions talk about the universe being a dream in God's mind, right? These would allow a sort of a substrate, a place where people interact with each other, but it just wouldn't be physical. Like there would be some regularities to it, but there could also be non-regularities. You could have people teleporting. You could just sort of appear in one place and disappear and appear in another place. You could have violations of ordinary laws. You could delete things and regenerate things. None of that would in any way impinge the ability to have relationships between characters in this world. So I don't buy that the universe has to be physical and entirely law-like in order for there to be an ability for minds to have relationships with each other. There may be some constraints on how chaotic it could be, but I don't think that those are going to require it to be entirely law-like. And certainly it doesn't require it to be physical. Again, you could have all of this just be non-physically instantiated. Like it does raise the question as to what we mean by physical. But for example, you could have a situation where space and time just don't work the way that they work in the physical world, right? So something is one way that physical is cashed out is in terms of having a position in space and time. So you could have a situation where there just isn't any space. Like the spatial location just doesn't mean anything. Just as God exists outside of space, and according to many Christians outside of time, so too could he create minds that exist outside of space and time and can interact with some sort of world, but just isn't spatial. Like why does it have to be spatial? Where does that come from? It seems like, I think the fundamental problem here is it seems like God is an exception to everything that's being claimed is necessary for minds to have relationships. Like, do we have a relationship with God? If the answer is yes, and if God exists outside of space at very least, and maybe outside of time as well, then clearly it's possible to have relationships between minds, at least one of which is outside of space and time. And likewise, I don't know, do angels exist outside of space and time? If the answer is yes, and God has relations with those, then similarly. Also, the persons of the Trinity have a relationship with each other. I talked about that before. And purely conceptually, there doesn't seem to be anything essential or particularly even helpful about having a physical world to interact with. Some sort of shared reality, potentially, but why does it have to be physical? The fact that it may share some properties in common with a physical universe, such as being a shared point of interaction or having some degree of regularity, doesn't follow that then it is a physical universe. And I think that's the fundamental problem with this line of argument, is that it identifies what I would describe as superficial similarities, or some degree of similarity between what you might need, arguably, for minds to have a relationship. Sort of some degree of interaction, some modest degree of regularity at the very least, not total chaos, perhaps. And so forth, and then just goes full on and identifies that with a law-like physical universe, even though there seem many other options. I just sort of mentioned one of them being some sort of simulation or a dream or a non-spatialized reality, or just a non-physical world, or something like the Trinity, where it doesn't seem that there's any external world necessary for there to be a relationship. So any of those possibilities are just kind of ruled out with that argument. So I'm not convinced that these arguments really really establish what they're supposed to establish, which is that some sort of law-like physical universe is necessary to have relationships between minds. All right, so I think that's what I want to say there. Let's move on to talking about other kinds of life.
I have to say to that. So one thing that they point out is Conway's game of life. Conway's game of life is a two-dimensional kind of way of, it's a two-dimensional, it's called a zero-player game. Basically, you have a bunch of squares, and the squares either are colored in or not colored in, depending upon certain rules programmed into each cell. They look at their neighbors. If there's too many neighbors, then they die. If there's too few, then they starve. But if there's just right, then they reproduce, basically. That's y'all need to research it. It's just really interesting. I'm not going to go too much further into it. But the basic idea is that Conway's
You can find this. Just find this clip in at like what is it? It's like 6:58. You can hear them talking about it if you want to go into this further.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about Conway's Game of Life is that you can make really complex things in it, and you might be able to actually make like a living organism in Conway's Game of Life, or you could make a Turing machine, and then like simulate a brain in it, for example. So it seems like that's actually something that would count as a fine-tuned universe if you had Conway's Game of Life. So what I'm bringing up this as an example because, oh, sorry, I forgot I wanted to talk about this. This is just I found a Conway's Game of Life game online. Proud of any of these constants, like you change by some red, by all these epistemically possible like universes with rules that govern it that would not allow you to have any sort of life in it. That's kind of what I'm getting at. This Conway's Game of Life, yeah, if that is actually a possibility under naturalism, well then so are going to be these other variations of Conway's Game of Life where you can't have anything interesting going on in them. And if we actually keep searching like these green dots that naturalists point us to and find that they have red like lots of ways to be dead surrounding them, epistemically varied, let me put it this way, if they have give us green dots, and in these green dots, there are universes with constants, and in these other weird universes, you have life. But we find that each time a naturalist can give us something like that, we can vary the constants, and they're just surrounded by inhospitable universes. And what that's going to make me think is that this is actually how naturalism looks. Naturalism looks like a completely red thing, like a sea of red with just green dots in it. Because that's what every time that we get a green dot, we just find swaths of red surrounding it. It seems like, to put it simply, every time you introduce into the naturalist probability space a way to be alive, you introduce way more ways to be dead. So for me, at least, I find I'm not convinced by this. There are other, or that this objection that there's way more to the probability space that we just haven't checked out. But that's just my particular feelings about it, essentially. Like, this is my intuition about it. Why should you trust that? You want something rigorous, right? But how, so thinking.
Yeah, so this is an objection. I think it's a good objection that's been raised before, which is that even if there are other possibilities of life, when we look into all of those particular possibilities, we see that modifying the parameters of those, I sort of skipped over the detail of this. Again, I have to go somewhere, so I need to try to get to the end. But the idea is that even in Conway's Game of Life or other examples of this, other forms of life, if you change the parameters of those, as far as we can tell, you still get a situation where most of the surrounding areas are do not support life. So you get, as he showed there, like maybe some small green dots, but surrounded by lots of red. So my counter to this, it's speculative. I talk about this in my book, right? Unreasonable Faith. My counter to this is that I don't see why we should expect the parameter space to have this regular structure, like is typically shown in these 2D or even 3D diagrams, where you have one dot surrounded by green or red or something like that. I hypothesize that the structure of the structure of parameter space in terms of which regions can support life and which can't, maybe a bit more like a sort of fractal or a strange attractor, as I show in my book, which basically means you could have a situation where surrounding any individual point, variation of a few parameters around that may be non-life permitting. But the number of overall points, or like maybe small regions, because points technically have zero volume, right? But small regions that are life permitting may actually be quite large if the structure is sufficiently complicated. One way to imagine this might be if you think of, would have been helpful to prepare a visualization here. If I can show you, yeah, because that's something like this, right? So imagine you're looking at something. So, okay, actually, this is a grid, right? So this is a 3x3 grid. And you see here that suppose that I'm looking at the top grid, right? The top middle grid here, right? Annoyingly, you can't see my cursor. But the top middle grid is sort of blank, right? And imagine if I moved like one to the left or one to the right or like one down. In each of those directions, I get something that's, not blank, like it's fuzzy. Now, on the basis of that inference, I might say, well, in all of the directions that I go, I get fuzzy. And so most of the area of the total area is fuzzy. But in this case, actually 3 out of the 9 squares are not fuzzy. And ideally what I would have done is I would have done it the case where this one on the middle left was also blank as well, right? So so you'd have 4 that were kind of blank and 5 that were fuzzy. So it's nearly 50-50, right? But it is also the case that when you move a direction, like in any one, like top, down, or side to side, it flips. So the point here is that there's a complex structure. If you move a little bit in either direction, let's just assume you can't go diagonal. This is just an illustration to get you the idea right. If you move one direction either way, it always looks like, oh, it's not life permitting. But actually, the total area that's life permitting is fairly high. So obviously, this is a very crude 2-dimensional representation of what I'm talking about. In reality, we're talking about many-dimensional parameter space. And so it's perfectly possible for the space of possible life-permitting regions to be highly complicated and sort of interwoven, such that, yeah, if you move a little bit in either direction, in any direction around a life-permitting point, you find a non-life-permitting point. But then the idea as well, if you moved a bit further in a couple of directions, you'd find another life-permitting point, and it's all structured in a very complicated way. That might sound ad hoc, but I don't actually think that that's ad hoc. All I'm saying is that the structure of which regions of parameter space are life-permitting and which are not could likely be very complicated and not obey any very particularly simple geometric relationships, at least throughout much of the region. Maybe there are some regions that are like that are blocked off, but all that I need to claim is that the total, like, hypervolume, the area of the total, I shouldn't say area, that the total fraction of the hypervolume of parameter space that is life permitting to some form of embodied life is not extremely small. It might still be less than half, right? That's not really critical to the argument. Maybe it's 1/10 or something, but it's just not extremely small. Like the fine tuning, the people who advocate for a fine tuning argument say that it's astronomically small. Whereas I say I don't think that's established. It could well be the case that there's many types of alternative life, even if they're locally surrounded by parameter values that are non-life supporting. It could well be the case that the entire hypervolume that's the entire the fraction of the hypervolume in multi-parameter space that is life supporting is a non-trivial fraction of the entire volume of the parameter space. So that's my argument there, and I think that it just relies on it having a very complicated sort of geometric structure, and I don't see any reason to think that it wouldn't have it, right? I mean, we don't have any particular reason for thinking that the space is one way or the other. Luke Barnes objected to this and said that quantum mechanical laws are linear in parameter space, but I think this misses the point, because that may be true about quantum mechanical laws in terms of like the parameters that they have, and you tend to carve up spaces in geometric regions if you look at some of these diagrams. But what they're doing here is they're looking at quantum mechanical relationships and whether they allow for the existence of things like protons or a stable bound particles or things like that. What I'm talking about is regions of parameter space that permit for the existence of embodied life. And that's not something that you can adjudicate just by looking at the existence of individual particles. That is a question about the entire complex relationship of the laws. As I said earlier, could we determine whether or not our own universe with our own constants is life permitting by just looking at these fundamental laws and the parameters and sort of trying to compute from that? I contend that we probably couldn't, at least not with our current knowledge and current computational power. And therefore, I don't think there's good reason to suspect that that's possible for other universes either. So the fact that quantum mechanics is linear in many of the constants is not really the issue here. The issue is we don't know what the structure of the space of life-permitting universes is with respect to those parameters. And for all we know, and I think there's reason to suspect that it may be a very complicated geometric relationship, which means that there could be most of the life-permitting regions could well be surrounded locally by non-life-permitting regions. We don't know. And I think that making a strong claim that, well, that's just implausible and that we can therefore infer global properties on the basis of local properties, I think is premature. And that's effectively what the argument is. Where was the diagram here? No, it was this one here, right? So the argument here is because each of the green dots is surrounded by a red region, that we can infer from that the proportion of the overall space that is red is higher than the overall space that is green. Obviously, that's true in this particular diagram, right? Because it's been drawn that way. But my claim is that knowledge, local knowledge, even if you suppose that we do have that local knowledge, which maybe we do in a few cases, this is like a local epistemically illuminated region. Someone asked about that before. Even if it's the case that locally surrounding the green dot, there are non-life permitting combinations of parameters, I do not think that we can infer that globally it is the case that there are significantly more non-life permitting than life permitting sets of parameters. And again, I say significantly more because even if it's 10 to 1 or 100 to 1, that only means that it's unlikely that we would see life permitting constants. What the fine-tuning advocates want to say is that it should be overwhelmingly, like astronomically unlikely, huge probabilities that they give. So, if it's only 1% chance, then obviously there's some explanatory work to do, but that's still way different from these astronomically small probabilities that are sometimes given. So the point there is, I don't buy this inference from local structure to global structure when we have no idea of most of what the space looks like. I think that that's premature, and I think that the the extremely low probabilities that are sometimes given give a false sense of certainty about this when we really have no idea, from my point of view, about what the overall structure looks like. And I don't think we can legitimately infer about the global structure from merely small, in the overall scheme of things, extremely small knowledge of non-representative local structure. I think that that's just far more than I'm sort of willing to accept. So that's the basis of my objection. Anyway, so it took a little longer to articulate than I'd hoped, but hopefully it kind of made the point there. Let's then go back to the formal argument and see.
I was thinking about how to be rigorous about it, and being rigorous about this question is actually really hard, because what we essentially need to do to be rigorous.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good way to put it, Deepak. Luke's argument is like saying QM is linear, therefore I can predict the stock market today using linear model. Yeah, that's a sort of... Oops, wrong button. Press the wrong button again. I meant to do that. Yeah, so because quantum mechanics is linear, it doesn't follow that we can predict which regions of parameter space are life supporting. And my argument is that there's no reason to suppose that that space has any sort of simple geometric structure. Yeah, okay, sorry, just getting back here.
About the checking the entire probability space of the naturalism side is look at the set of all possible physical universes, which is like this infinitely large set, where every element of that set is we could represent every possible physical universe as a set of ordered pairs of moments and physical states of that universe. To get this whole, I'm going to just call it large P for the set of all possible physical universes, and these little p's represent possible universes. And each possible universe is a set of ordered pairs of moments and states, physical states, to get the set of all possible physical universes. Don't want to repeat myself anymore. Moving on. What I'd essentially have to do to be rigorous is then get a function and define it well so that we could see, it will tell us what elements of big P are life permitting, and then compare that to the cardinality of the set of non-life permitting possible physical universes. That's really tough. But one thing I did realize is that there's going to be a lot of chaos.
Sorry, Dominic, I was busy in my explanation, but thanks for your donation, and thanks for the kind words as well. Oh, why do I always go to the wrong place to turn that off?
Chaotic possible physical universes in big P. Like this possible physical universe, I just picked this one at random. In the first moment, we have a physical state that just consists of 4 particles. Then in the next moment, we have a physical state consisting of a line. Then in the next moment, we have a physical state representing a recursive centaur, which is half horse and half recursive centaur. I just found that funny. And then in the last moment, we have a physical state, which is just empty. Like that, given the way we've tried to rigorously define the set of all possible physical universes, that's one universe right here. And it's just chaotic. It does not follow any sort of physical laws. So you can't actually have any fine-tuned life in that. And in the big P, the set of all possible physical universes is going to be dominated by chaotic universes. Because just think about this kind of set here. We have one moment a line, and it's moving across different sets, different physical states. And then we get to this branching here where it could go in either direction or any of these directions. We're going to have one little p in the big P representing each of these possible directions for it to go. Like, this is going to be one of the little p's, this is going to be a little p, this is going to be a little p, this is going to be a little p. And so what we're going to have is that big B here, its contents are dominated by chaotic universes that don't follow any sort of physical laws, whereas we have at the far end here the actual set of universes that are that are ordered and do follow physical laws. So just to summarize that, in case I wasn't making any sense, I'm trying to be rigorous here to talk about the entire naturalism probability space. So we're talking about every possible way you could have a physical universe. But every possible way you could have a physical universe is going to involve a lot of chaotic universes where just stuff randomly happening. As long as that stuff that randomly happens is physical, it's still a physical universe. So naturalism is going to get dominated by these chaotic universes that don't have any laws governing them. So how does the naturalist get around this? Well, the same reason anyone's going to get around this is that you're going to introduce some metaphysical stuff into your worldview that gets around these chaotic universes, that says these chaotic universes can't happen. But I really want, I would really like to hear what the naturalist would introduce for these metaphysical, metaphysical theses that are going to stop all these chaotic universes from being added to their probability space. Because once they do it, like say they think that all substances are fundamentally particles, and particles have XYZ causal powers at all times, and that's why all these chaotic universes can't happen. If you give me some thesis like that, well, that's going to annihilate a lot of this gray area here, because Conway's game of life, for example, isn't made of particles. Or you say something about the initial state of the universe and why, and you describe to me what causal powers it has and say it's metaphysically necessary. That will get rid of the chaos, but it will also get rid of a large chunk of the gray. So that's I think an interesting kind of Goldilocks problem that the naturalist has as well, because if the metaphysical theses that they adopt are so strict that they restrict us to only the stuff physicists have studied, then, well, the theist is going to win out over the naturalist. But if the metaphysical theses aren't strict enough, then they're going to include they're going to include chaotic universes in the epistemic probability space, which is going to win out over the fog.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
I'm not really sure I understand this objection. It seems that we've moved from talking about the values of physical constants to the laws themselves, because none of the parameter values result in chaotic universes. Well, I mean, chaos isn't really well defined, is it? What I mean by that is that the fine-tuning argument is typically, particularly the one that Nathan and I were responding to by, I can't remember his name now, in the Blackwell Companion. Someone in the chat will remember. But anyway, that's explicitly based on varying physical constants in our current laws of physics, but not the laws themselves. The laws stay the same. And I think this is the problem with the argument, is that it's a bit ad hoc, and it may not even make sense to treat the values of the parameters separately from, or the values of the constants rather, separately from the equations that they fit into. That I think is an interesting question. But the point here is that with any value of the constants, you stick them into the equations and you can at least do the math and see what comes out. I don't know that you can predict whether that type of universe is going to be life permitting, but you can at least work through the equations. And in that sense, it's not chaotic. It's still governed by the same equations. That's the point I wanted to make here. So I don't know exactly what and in terms of this example here, where we had the different, where was it? Where we had sort of just bizarre stuff happening with a particle moving in a trajectory, and then just sort of strange things happen. So I don't see why that's going to happen, because the equations are the same, right? Maybe I'm not understanding the basis of the objection, but the point is not that we're talking about all of the metaphysically possible or even like logically possible arrangements of things that could be counted as a universe. Obviously, most of those won't be life permitting, because most of those would just be garbage, right? If you just imagine rearranging the stuff in the universe in arbitrary ways, and irrespective of whether that's even physically possible, well, yeah, most of that's going to be nonsense, right? But that's not really what the fine-tuning argument is about at all. The fine-tuning argument is about varying, or imagining that we're varying the constants in a given set of in the fixed set of equations that describe the universe, as far as we understand it. So I don't really understand this objection at all. I mean, yeah, I don't know what else to say, that it just doesn't seem relevant to how I understand the argument. In terms of the argument as to, well, why is it that we see an ordered universe? Why do these laws of physics exist at all? That's just as much a problem for theists as it is for naturalists. You could say that God likes an ordered universe, but it's not really clear why. That's not really an explanation, right? Particularly because God can do miracles. So why? I mean, that seems to be, if God likes an ordered universe, but sometimes he does miracles, that seems to be almost the definition of an ad hoc argument, right? Is that usually he likes it, except sometimes he doesn't. And there's no clear explanations to why he sometimes does miracles. Now, you could go the full deist route, which is that God likes an ordered universe so much that he sets it going and establishes the laws and then does nothing, and then doesn't intervene because he got it right the first time. I have some sympathy with that sort of view, but it rules out traditional Christianity. So I don't think that that's the approach you're going to appeal to here. The point I'm making is, if the question is, why is it that we have the laws that we do that give us an ordered, reasonably predictable universe, then I don't think the theist has any good answer, and nor does really the naturalist. The naturalist, of course, can say, well, the laws are just metaphysically necessary, which is what Oppie says. And I I mean, it's not even really an explanation, right? It's just it's a stipulation. Maybe it's true, right? It means that it doesn't need an explanation if it's metaphysically necessary. But I don't think that that's a great response, but it's certainly no worse than anything the theist has to offer, which is just, well, God made it that way, and he did because he just did, right? I don't. So the 2 points here is, I don't think this is really relevant to the fine-tuning argument. This is asking, where do the laws come from, or why aren't they chaotic, at least as I've understood the objection here. So it's really a different point. And the second issue is that I don't think anyone has a very good explanation as to why the laws are the way they are. Naturalists could say that they're metaphysically necessary. Theists could say the same thing if they wanted to, or they could say that God just sort of decided to create them that way because, I don't know, for whatever reason or no reason at all. Is that better than the naturalists' option? I don't think it is, right? So I'm not seeing what the objection is to naturalism here. Anyway, sorry, I'm just having a quick look at chat. Yeah, well, that's sort of what I'm getting out of this. Chaos implies there isn't a rule set. I mean, chaos theory means its own thing, right? Because there are chaotic systems, even in deterministic. Quite simple rules can give rise to chaotic behavior, but I don't think that's what he's talking about here. Like a double pendulum is a chaotic system, with enough energy you put into it, it can give rise to chaotic behavior. But I don't think that's really what he's talking about. I think he's sort of just talking about really the absence of any clear rules and just sort of totally bizarre behaviors, like this sort of a particle goes along and then it turns into whatever the hell that is, right? Transitions of states that just have no real like law-like regularities between them, and that just has no relationship to the fine-tuning argument as we've been discussing it, which is about varying parameters within established fixed laws. Yeah, so I'm a little confused here about the relevance of this. I acknowledge I may have misunderstood what this is supposed to be objecting to, but as far as I understand it, it seems irrelevant.
A lot of clips from like James and Nathan, and I think that's because like Square does a really good job of like kind of like overviewing
by physical laws. Obviously, you're not going to allow that. So you're going to have to give me some metaphysical thesis to say to outlaw universes that don't follow any sort of physical laws yet are nonetheless physical. And once you do that, though, those metaphysical theses could very well outlaw a bunch of the foggy stuff as well. So then the theist is in better standing. There's less gray for them to have to worry about.
Okay, so you're talking about like the disposition idea then more is what we're looking at now.
No, that's later.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It's fine. I'll just move on. If that part made no sense, I apologize.
No, I'm totally tracking with you. I think I just have the labels wrong with like the exact section we're at. But yeah, I'm totally tracking with you. So
okay, awesome. Yeah, if I know there were clips we wanted to play, and if I'm just skipping over them, I apologize. But I think I'm not doing that. I think
we're doing good. I mean, obviously, I know that like we aren't playing a lot of clips from like James and Nathan, and I think that's because like Square does a really good job of like kind of like overviewing the arguments and whatnot. And we might play a little bit more. We're not sure yet. But yeah,
we're on to the mysterious disposition part. If you want to play that,
okay, I will play that clip. I'll pull it up in a second. It'll take a minute because I had to close out my tab again. But it's coming up here.
Disclaimer: we are responding to 9 hours of content, so there is a good chance that I've missed points that they've made, or they've like responded to individual points I've made up, or brought up that and they've like responded somewhere in the 9 hours, and I've just missed it. So feel free to watch their whole stream to fact check me, because there's a good I think I've been thorough. I think I'm responding to their points, but there is that possibility that I've missed something.
You mean you're telling me you can't remember the entire 9?
I better remember what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think that's something Nathan and I need to do better, is to break some of this up into more manageable segments. And I think it would be unreasonable to say, oh, well, in this 2 minutes in the 9 hours, I actually said this. Although the thing is that, and you didn't respond to that, the thing is that Craig does this quite a lot, like where he says that, look, in my hundreds of page long, boring book, well, he doesn't call them boring, right? But his books about philosophy of time, for example, I discuss this in this particular section. Well, he usually doesn't mention the section, right? But it's basically the argument from volume. It's like, well, I've written or said so much about this, and you have to look through all of it to respond properly. I think that's lousy, and I wouldn't want to put that on other people. Even though a 9 hour stream is long, it's a lot shorter than trying to read one of Craig's academic books. Anyway, but yeah, so I wouldn't want to pull a cheap shot like that. But I think that Square's been really good in representing my arguments accurately. Let's get through this mysterious I do need to leave fairly soonish. I'm hoping to get through most of the rest of the
now at this point. Actually, I think that I must be missing something, because it seems to be like it seems to me that the answer to it is like, so obvious that I know I must be missing something kind of idea, but maybe I'm not. Maybe I just have a different perspective on it. So and that's why I'm seeing this possibility. But basically, they're adding to their naturalism, and a disposition towards this green dot here. Like somehow the universe is predisposed towards being fine-tuned. And oh, by the way, I'm just drawing it as a sea of red now, just for simplicity, instead of having the fog there. Anyways, and the idea here is that they're saying they're not going to tell you much about the disposition. They're going to leave it kind of mysterious because God is mysterious. And I'm going to be like, okay, fair game. But I have this hypothesis. It's this naturalism plus another disposition. It's predisposed to this red dot down here. It's just pointing to one specific red dot here. And I'm not going to tell you much more than that. But the universe is predisposed towards that dot. Oh, and I have this other mysterious disposition. Naturalism plus a disposition towards this red dot, one specific red dot up there. And I'm not going to tell you much more than that. And I'm just going to keep giving you naturalism plus other mysterious dispositions until we get like a disposition per dot in the naturalism probability space, and we end up with naturalism once again. Maybe stuff has moved around, but like everything's going to have the same probability. But the introduction of dispositions doesn't do anything. Now, dispositions, they do affect like real probabilities, I guess. And like you might like say I flip an indeterministic coin. There's like the real probability of like say 50-50, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about epistemic probabilities. So dispositions don't really help you with epistemic probabilities because any disposition is epistemically possible. So until you give me a reason to prefer one rather than the other, they're all going to be equally likely epistemically. And so we just end up with naturalism again. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Same goes for necessity as well. Like you could say naturalism plus these fine-tuned constants are metaphysically necessary. Well, I'm going to give you another thesis. Naturalism plus the fine-tuned, these constants here, which are not fine-tuned, but these specific values of constants that this red dot has, they're metaphysically necessary. And in this thesis here is that naturalism is true, and this dot here is metaphysically necessary, and so on and so forth until we get naturalism once again. It seems that adding necessities or dispositions doesn't affect epistemic probability space at all. Mm-hmm. Because remember, different metaphysically necessary things are all epistemically possible. So it's epistemically possible that it's metaphysically necessary that there is a three-sided shape, and it's epistemically possible that it's metaphysically necessary that there is a four-sided shape. Or so until you give me a reason to prefer one to the other, then I'm going to say that they're epistemically equiprobable or something like that. So until you give me a reason to prefer this mysterious disposition towards this one part of the probability space as opposed to another part of the probability space, I'm just going to continue to believe that they're all epistemically equally likely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just before you get into your summary, just like.
Well, the problem with that is that it seems to be. So the whole point of this mysterious disposition is that it's this stalking horse argument, as Malpass says, which means that it's basically just a parody of a theistic argument, except of the argument that God made it this way, God fine-tuned the universe, except that it's saying it's not God, it's some mysterious disposition. It's just something that isn't God, right, that made it so that it's this way. And so because of that, it's a direct parallel, or it's supposed to be a direct parallel of the theistic argument. And so if the response is, well, but we have no reason to believe that the mysterious disposition works in this way rather than all of these other possible ways, and therefore we just sort of go back to the situation we were in before, then that is going to apply to God as well. So to put it another way, suppose that God wanted to create a universe that, suppose we say that God fine-tuned the universe so that the constants have the values that they did. Well, we could say, well, unless there's a reason to believe that, then you could just as well say that God could have fine-tuned the universe to have some other set of constants or another set of constants or another set of constants, right? Until you just build up the space in exactly the same way. Like the exact argument that he made there is almost the same as I would make the argument against why theism is a bad explanation, because I can't get the exact one I wanted. And it's like all bunched up. Or whatever, when he's adding on the areas like that. To say, well, there could be a disposition to go this way or a disposition to go that way or so on and so forth, right? The same argument can be applied to God. It seems that there's maybe a double standard being used here. I'd have to think about this a bit more carefully before I accuse the double standards. But Craig does this, right? He sort of says, well, your hypothesis is undermotivated, and why think that it's true, right? But then when people ask, well, why think that your theistic hypothesis is correct, is like the correct explanation, he just sort of he says, well, it doesn't need to have additional evidence for it. It could be true, like it's an explanatory option, right? So that's sufficient. And And that seems to be the argument here. It's like the naturalist can't just say, for example, that there is a mysterious disposition towards a universe that supports life. They also have to give positive reason as to why I think that there is that specific disposition. But if we're going to apply the same criteria, it would seem to be the case that the theist can't simply say that God fine-tuned the universe to have these specific set of constants, because they would also need to say, why did God fine-tune the universe to have this specific set of constants and not all of the other constants that he could have fine-tuned it to be? I mean, the theist would typically say, well, that's because God wanted to have embodied life, and only this set of constants, if fine-tuning is correct, would give embodied life. But then the parallel is that the naturalist says, well, yeah, the universe has a mysterious disposition to give rise to have the constants that give rise to embodied life. And so that's why it has these constants. I don't understand, where's the symmetry breaker here? I think that's what I'm missing. I don't quite understand. It's sort of like saying that epistemically, it could just as well be the case that the universe has all these other dispositions. But then epistemically, it could just be the case that God has all of these other dispositions. Basically, when naturalists advance this stalking horse proposition, talk about mysterious dispositions, just delete mysterious and place God in its position. And that's supposed to be what the theist is arguing, right? So if there's an argument that there could be, that epistemically there could be just as many other mysterious dispositions to be different, or even or there could be, as far as you know, different metaphysical necessities. Just the same argument goes with respect to God's creative act. As far as you know, God could have created any which of ways. If God's creative act is supposed to be explanatory with respect to why we have the values we do, then the stalking horse hypothesis of a mysterious disposition should be precisely as explanatory. In fact, it should be more explanatory, because at least the stalking horse hypothesis about mysterious dispositions rules out non-physical universes, because it's supposed to be only like a predisposition towards a physical universe. So it's actually slightly more explanatory as to why we observe the universe as we do, because God has to explain why not only did he make as we have to explain under God's creative act, why did he make this universe out of all the possible physical universes, plus all the non-physical ones that he could have made. So there's actually a wider space of possibilities there. So any naturalist hypothesis is actually going to be, I think, slightly more explanatory to that extent. But even if you ignore that, they're within the naturalist realm, like within the realm of possible sets of constants, they're just as explanatory, because they're just postulating precisely the same disposition. And that's, I don't think, has been appreciated in this response to the argument. Again, if I've understood it correctly, because it just basically seems to be saying, yeah, but why think that that's, the naturalist says there's a mysterious disposition, and the square says, why think that? Well, that's exactly parallel to the theist says, God made it this way, and the atheist says, why think that? Like that doesn't break any sort of asymmetry. The question is, which is the best explanation? And the argument is that the mysterious disposition is no worse. It's on par, it seems, with the God hypothesis, at least on this level. And then you could consider further issues about, further problems of God as a hypothesis. And I think that on that basis, you could potentially rule out God, right? But the mysterious disposition is supposed to be at least no worse an explanation than the fine-tuning explanation, like the theistic fine-tuning explanation. And on that basis, therefore, we should be indifferent between them. On that specific basis, maybe there's further reasons we should prefer one to the other. So I just don't get this objection. All right, let's watch the summary here, and then there's a couple of small sections that I'm going to have to run.
They might not need to invoke as many theses. I think naturalism has a good chunk of green, although the kind of abstract reasoning I gave might still leave a lot of space open for orange. And there is a good question and there's quite a bit of gray down here as well, because at the bottom left here, because we can't know with certainty what kinds of things God would prefer, but I think we can have a pretty good idea. On the naturalism side, I think it is probably red. There's like a sea of red with lots of green dots in it. It's foggy, I admit that. So if I'm not excluding the possibility that the naturalist will find a blob of green, but as far as it stands for me, I really don't think that there's any blobs of green hiding in there. So that's where I would put the fine-tuning argument at the end of the day. That's my analysis.
Yeah. So just to summarize here, I think this could be helpful. Like, so when we're looking at like how theism does with explaining fine tuning, obviously I see like if a theism like a little bit lower, like initial probability, because it's a little bit smaller rectangle. But like with like theism, we'd have pretty good reason to think that like if God were to create a universe, he'd create a universe with some sort of like embodied moral agent. So we talked a lot about that in the beginning of the video. They're not saying like God necessarily has to. And then, like, given naturalism, it seems unlikely that there'd be a universe that would allow for embodied moral agents, because even like, sure, there's some vagueness, and sure, we don't know everything, and sure, there could be like other forms of life, but for every way that like things could go right, there's a lot more ways things could go wrong. And so it just seems like fine tuning would be some sort of evidence in favor of theism.
Yeah, so I think that this is a useful way to represent it, but my overall contention is that the relative sizes of these areas that are claimed is undermotivated. From my point of view, the fine-tuning advocate has the burden of proof to establish that they plausibly know what the relative sizes of these areas are. Sometimes it says that, well, you don't know that there's green, that there's life-permitting areas out there in parameter space. And my contention to that is I don't need to show that there are. I need to call the advocate of fine-tuning argument to account and ask them to show that they know that there aren't such reasons there, because they're the one making the argument, right? The burden is on he who asserts, not on he who denies. If I say, I don't think that you can show plausibly that there aren't blobs of green out there, and they say, well, prove that there aren't, right? That's just shifting the burden of proof. That's like claiming that there's a pot orbiting Jupiter, and when someone says, I don't think that you can show that there's a pot orbiting Jupiter, they say, well, prove that there isn't. So I don't accept that. As I've said before, the claim is that there, as far as we know, and I think as far as we have any business in claiming to know, the overall area in this simplified two-dimensional case, the total area that supports life, so the total green area under naturalism, could be comparable in size to the red area, or even if it's 10% or something like that, that's still not that much smaller. It's not astronomically smaller. That's my claim. As far as we know, it's not astronomically smaller. The geometry of that may be extremely complicated, but I don't think anyone has shown us reason to believe that the total volume in parameter space of green under naturalism is low. All of the arguments relate primarily to carbon-based life and small epistemically illuminated regions in parameter space around that, and maybe a few alternatives like the Conway's game of life, even though Conway's game of life isn't supposed to be a serious alternative, right? Because that doesn't use the same laws as our current universe does. It's just a thought experiment, really, to get us to understand that there are other possibilities out there in terms of simple systems that can give rise to things that exhibit very complicated behaviors and that are sort of self-sustaining and things like that. But anyway, so the point is, I don't think anyone's established that. So I sort of reject that this has been established under naturalism, or really that anyone knows this. I think if you press, it's basically just based on intuition that it just seems like it shouldn't be the case that there are lots of possibilities for complex life. But I don't think there's any basis for that. Now, as for undertheism, well, again, the arguments that were given in this video for why God would create embodied life, I think, were very weak. They're basically reduced to, it's good for some reason for God to create minds that can relate to each other, and that wasn't really explained as to why that's the thing that God would do. And furthermore, in order for minds to relate to each other, there needs to be some mind-independent, physical, law-like world for them to exist in. But that wasn't really explained as to why that's the case. And I gave a number of potential counters to this, such as God himself, who apparently is a disembodied mind who can have relations within his three persons and also relations with us. So there's God himself, there's angels and demons, there's the idea of like electrons in love, just some sort of non-physical world that it's like non-spatialized, or there's like a simulation hypothesis, a dream hypothesis, just all sorts of ways that the world could be non-physical and or like non-spatial and or entirely law-like and still have relations between minds. It's just entirely undermotivated as to why the law-like material world needs to exist at all. And so I don't accept that the argument's been made that there's a significant region of probability space under theism where we would expect that. Also, not addressed is the question as to why God even if God does need or want a physical world, as to why it needs to have the right constants in order to support embodied life, right? Because remember, God can do miracles, so he could make a world that is inconsistent, that is incompatible with complex embodied life, and yet complex embodied life exists anyway, because, I mean, isn't that what a miracle is, right? It contravenes the laws of nature, and it sort of still happens. So I don't know why fine-tuning is necessary, even if, and this is the key point, even if God wants to create a physical world, you kind of have to assume that he likes it to be law-like without miracles for some reason, except then sometimes he does miracles. This is why I regard it as an ad hoc explanation, is that it doesn't seem to have any underlying consistency to it. So I don't buy that it's been established with any plausibility that the area under theism for embodied life is high, nor that it's been established with any real plausibility that the area of green under naturalism is low. And so that's why I think the fine-tuning argument is not good. I don't need to establish that the green area under naturalism is high. I simply need to undercut any reasons given by the theists to say that we should think that it is low. And thanks for Deepak as well. I think the fine-tuning argument probably is the best argument for theism, but I don't think it's very good. Yeah, I think the others are mostly even worse. Okay, so I've got to run very soon. I'm going to skip the moral argument because it's not really that relevant here. I do want to know what they have to say about non-physical angels, because I did mention that before.
Okay, and James objects that, okay, it's actually part of Christian theology that there are non-physical beings. And I would say that for our purposes, they actually do count as physical. Like if you think of like ghosts or the best biblical cherubim picture I could find online, they are in some sense physical, because if you think about it, the eyes of this ghost here have to interact with photons, and the teeth of it to kill Mario. This is Mario Ghost. To kill Mario, it has to apply pressure with its teeth. The wings of the cherubim, they are spatially, the feathers on it are spatially related to one another. Its eyes interact with photons and all that fun stuff. So like they actually do stuff to physical matter. And if we could explain the way that these things apply to physical matter that with mathematical equations, well, then we could just call those the physical laws that govern these things. So I think that actually in Christian theology, when we say that angels are non-physical, we have to be careful, because like every biblical portrayal of an angel does have it like doing things that could be mathematically described, that we could just call those mathematical descriptions physical laws. I think what we have to interpret the statement angels are non-physical as they don't follow our physics. But that's for our purposes. It doesn't matter. We're talking about like all kinds of weird physics, so that doesn't matter.
Oh, I think this is a very, very bad objection. Okay, so first of all, theologically, I'm not really sure on what ground he's standing on here and how firm a ground he's standing on with respect to angels and ghosts being physical. Certainly not what I've heard others say about that. But that's for the theologians to decide. If they want to say that all of these are actually physical, well, I mean, good on them in some sense. But I don't think that that's going to work for a lot of Christians. Also, the fact that the Bible describes angels in ways that could readily be sort of thought of as physical, or that seem to be involved, like interacting with photons and things, isn't that the case with God as well? Like, doesn't it talk about God speaking and like the hand of God and imply that he changes his mind? Like the way that particularly the Old Testament talks about God is very anthropomorphized. So I don't know how literally you want to take that in the case of God. I don't know, therefore, how literally you want to take that in the case of angels. But again, that's something for the biblical theologians or whatever to worry about. I'm sure there's many ways to interpret that, but I'm just not really sure that that's going to work very well. But certainly within philosophy, there's a clear distinction. Well, maybe not clear, but there's a distinction that's made between something that's material and immaterial, or particularly a physical, like embodied mind, and a disembodied mind, or some sort of dualist disembodied mind or spirit, perhaps. Like, I mean, there's a conceptual distinction to be made there. So surely we can at least talk about that. And traditionally, many Christians have thought that God is as such a mind, as well as angels, as well as maybe demons, as well as humans potentially that have some sort of disembodied soul. So if these are possible, then why bother with the whole physical mind and physical body part of it? Why not just go with the non-physical parts? Like God went both ways for no very clear reason. So I don't think that saying angels are physical is really going to, I mean, unless you want to go full Christian physicalism, which is interesting, right? But then that's a whole other argument. But then there's a further problem here, is that to say that angels maybe obey different laws, and therefore they're physical, but in a sort of a different sense, but they can still interact with us. In my mind, that just completely demolishes the whole fine-tuning argument, because that says that there can be different sets of physical laws that serve as a substrate for embodied intelligent, like embodied in this sort of metaphysical sense, right? Like angel type embodied intelligent life. Squared has just said here that he believes apparently that in our world, there is our type of embodied life that obeys one set of rules and angelic type of embodied life that obeys different sets of rules, and they can interact with each other, but also be separate. So it seems that there are multiple possibilities, at least two, right? And if there are two, well, how many others are there? Possible sets of laws that can sustain embodied life. Why did God choose those two? Why not 3 or 4 or 10 trillion sets of laws that can sustain different types of embodied life? And they can even apparently interact with each other in some ways. So their sort of existences can overlap to some extent, right? So they can still interact with each other. Maybe, in fact, God could have created a universe where each mind is in some sense physical and embodied, but operates in accordance with its own set of physical laws. Again, physical here in this sort of quotes, inverted quotes sense. So you could have 1 billion human beings, all of whom are in some sense physically instantiated, but all of whom have their own sets of physical laws that they interact with each other with, just kind of like angels, but except there's not one angelic laws. There's like a set of laws for each person, right? That's just as consistent apparently with the way that God did it in the angels case. I think this totally undermines the whole the whole impetus for the case of fine-tuning, which is that there's like one way that we've found, or one narrow way that we've found to have embodied life. And if embodied life is good, then even God just needs to make it this way. Whereas now we've just found a second one just by a sort of very hand-wavy argument about, well, it seems that, angels are kind of physically, right? So I guess that they obey their own laws. Like, whoa, we've just found another one. Like, how many other ones does God have up his sleeve, so to speak? And so then why has he chosen this one? And then the whole fine-tuning argument goes out the window because it no longer seems fine-tuned. It seems that God has all of these options available, and we're unable to explain why he did it this particular way, either with respect to just people or with respect to people and angels. You see what I'm saying here? To open up the can of worms to these profusion of possibilities, I think just completely undermines the entire motivation for the fine-tuning argument, which is supposed to be that it allows, if you at least buy that God wants to create embodied physical life, it explains why we observe what we observe. But now it seems that God had so many other options that he just sort of didn't choose for no apparent reason, even given he wanted to create embodied life, that the explanatory power is just completely dissolved. So I'm really surprised by this response here. Anyway, I'm kind of flabbergasted that he would make this response, to be honest. It seems to really undermine the rest of the argument here. Anyway, I would kind of like to look at the last little bit about theism having explanatory power, but I'm going to be late if I look at that. So I encourage you to finish out the last few minutes of this video. I don't want to kind of steal their thunder if there's any last little quippy comments that they made, but unfortunately I need to run off. So thanks to Zach and Squared for their responses here. I think that they did a good job. No, I don't want to press that. I want to press that. Yeah, I don't find their responses very, very convincing. Although I think that some of those diagrams were, if a little odd in that they were hand drawn. Maybe you could just, type the labels in for them to be a bit easier to read. But in terms of areas, we're helpful in explicating some of the issues here. But at the end of the day, I'm still not convinced that theism can explain why God would have any particular likelihood of creating an embodied a universe that's consistent with embodied life and that has regular laws and all of that stuff, and that's fine-tuned. Nor am I convinced that theists can really give us good reason to think that the proportion of parameter space that is consistent with embodied life is low. I think that it's largely based on supposition and hand-waving. So I'm not convinced by that either. That being said, the fine-tuning argument is still probably the best argument for the existence of God. I think that actually, if you consider all types of teleological types arguments, it moves you very slightly in the direction of theism. So that's a lot more than I would say about most arguments of theism, but I still think that they're just not very convincing and require a lot of assumptions that it's completely reasonable to reject. And then when stacked against all of the reasons for rejecting, particularly like a Christian conception of God, yeah, I don't find it convincing. Anyway, thanks very much, everyone, for your time. And thanks for the couple of people who made donations. I appreciate that. I think the next thing probably won't be for a few weeks, and maybe actually the bad apologetics with Nathan, where we do the apologetics industrial complex. So stay tuned for that. Maybe I'll do a video before then. Depends how I'm going. But otherwise, take care of yourselves. Keep thinking, keep reading, and talk to you then. Bye.